Hi all, thank you very much for joining us today. This time we will continue our discussions on Rand's thoughts on the culture. Today's essay is The Establishing of an Establishment. It's from 1972, Philosophy Who Needs It. We have James Valliant. He's the author of Creating Christ and The Passion of Fine Rand's Critics. Before we begin, please, to the audience that is listening live, feel free to send us a super chat. We will be tracking that live. Okay, let's start, James. And I think to start, we think we should start at the beginning. And Rand describes a very particular kind of atmosphere. Um, could you give us an idea of what she's describing and what is the kind of weather that she's seeing? And do you think that it's similar to this culture to the one that Rand's identifying?
The culture of the time as it struck her was gray, stale, boring, conformist, very little originality. People stuck to sort of their aesthetic or party lines in art or ideology. And it didn't matter what area of the intellectual or cultural landscape we look at. It's this stale, boring conformity. And in her way of looking at things, before World War I, when she was a child and born, there was a vibrant, exciting debate and culture going on. There were new things going on in art, radically new things going on all the time. Even in the 1920s, when she was a young woman, comparatively, the culture by the late 1960s and 1970s had become a stale, gray, uniform thing by comparison, boring by comparison. And she asks the philosophical question, gee, people act, artists and intellectuals are acting as though they live under a censorship, as though they live in medieval Europe where the Catholic Church could burn them, or in the Soviet Union where they could be sent to a gulag for what they believed, or even the nature of their art. So what causes men and women who are living in a society like in the West, the United States or Great Britain, why do these people act as though they're living under a censorship? And you ask whether it's changed over the course of time. In some ways, it has. There are different voices, but that stale conformity, that grayness, has continued. Most certainly, you can see it in so many different areas. Let's take two examples. Film. Nothing could be more stale, gray, and boring than a reboot and a remake, and Hollywood is doing nothing but remakes and reboots these days. Okay, now added to those reboots and remakes is a sort of political correctness that has to be added as a dimension to all of this, because that's sort of the accepted consensus now. But every single one has the same gray, boring, stale, politically correct message inside of a action adventure film that they've made 16 other times over, which is mostly a car chase. Now, that is a stale, gray, boring, conformist culture that is existing without a cultural censorship in effect. Or take politics. If you were not every single channel, now there may be right-wing newspapers and television channels and internet outlets now, as well as left-wing ones. In the 70s, that was less the case, but even so, both sides seem to be taking a sort of conformist line, and it's sort of a religious line. And if the leftist commentator, for example, does not hew the line on intersectional Marxism, which is repeated with the same language over and over in newspapers and news articles, it's as though they're following some party line. It's as if the Communist Party ruled everything. They sent down the word from on high, and all the intellectuals and journalists on the left follow suit, as if they were living under a censorship. What can explain that in a free society, Ayn Rand asks. So, and on the right, yeah, sure, there's more right-wing outlets today, and perhaps in news, on television and in the internet, and I really do believe there are, but even they follow the same gray, stale, conformist line of their own. Yeah, what causes cultural dynamics to come to such a screeching halt, and in a world without censorship? That's the question Ayn Rand's asking.
Yes, that's where I was going to move the question forward. When I was reading this essay, I tried to ask myself, like, do I think that the culture was the same? And the thing that brought into my mind was this movie of Netflix, that came up 2.5 years ago, Roma by Alfonso Cuarón, which had like a huge press, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, Roma, Roma!" And I watched it, and it was so boring, but it wasn't also like super boring, but also it was like a copy paste of a copy paste of a copy paste, and I can imagine someone in the 1940s watching Fellini or whatever and saying, "Oh, at last something new, like the cure to insomnia," but seeing Roma, which is basically a copy of that, again and again, I think there's
Well, it's interesting because even the exciting, say, artists of the 1960s, like Fellini, or some of the other artists of the 1960s, they present as being something new and radical, and really it is the same sort of thing. If Fellini was doing something interesting and had interesting characters and wild plots, that's one thing. But is he really philosophically outside the mainstream? Was he philosophically outside the mainstream, or was it just another reboot, sort of, in its own way, of absurdist theater and that sort of thing? Even the most daring, say, artists of the 1960s and 70s, like, say, Fellini, were they really original? Were they really saying something new? Or were they really just trotting out the same cultural line in his own form that so many other artists were? Don't get me wrong. I actually admire some of Fellini's cinematographic skills, but his philosophy, the sense of life of his films, was that really outside the 20th century mainstream? I'd say no.
I agree. I just said it like in the sense of that it was new in the sense of cure to insomnia.
Yeah,
Just that.
sure. His own, yes. Interesting characters and
Yes.
faces and situations, that's for sure.
So you said it. What is the cause of this climate? What is driving this culture if it's not censorship? Despite that, it looks like censorship in the way that people behave. But what is it? Does Rand attribute this to?
Ayn Rand does indicate that there's really only one way to shut down the mind, and that's with physical force. And of course, the most effective form of government of physical force is government censorship. And so we see in historical periods, uh, maybe the quintessential ones in this regard of creating a cultural or intellectual establishment are, as I say, medieval Europe, when the Catholic, before the Reformation, when the Catholic Church really set a specific doctrine. And if you went too far outside of that doctrine, they would torture and burn you to death. You couldn't really step outside that cultural establishment to create that word. And or take the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin. He created a cultural establishment that if you were any kind of dissenter from, you would find yourself in a psychiatric hospital because you're not all with it, because you disagree with our party line or their line. Those are force established, censorship established establishments. We can do that by means of government force, but an indirect means of government force, government encouragement, government subsidies, government sanction, because government inherently is an agency of force. It collects its money by force, taxation, at least so far in human history, although that's not necessary in my view. But they are an agency of force. They do take money and crowd other people out of that field when they subsidize a certain business, or they subsidize an art, or they subsidize certain intellectual activity. And in doing that, they create an establishment by force that is something other than a censorship, something less totalitarian. There's still a chance for free voices like ours to get out there. But what it does do is it creates a sort of a consensus view that you're just a wacko nut outsider if you don't buy into, accept, and repeat. And so the examples are legion, and government subsidies of the arts and education are particularly notorious in this regard. What they have done is they've in effect created an intellectual or cultural party line by saying what is worth government subsidization and what is not worth government encouragement. The minute government enters the realm of education, scientific research, the arts, it has crossed a line and it is forcing values on people. The same thing that's wrong with an established state religion, the same thing that's wrong with a censorship in political speech, is wrong in art, science, every cultural element. Once the government starts even encouraging and subsidizing it, it's crowding others out. It's creating an establishment line, and so it's, to go to her title, it's establishing an establishment, a cultural establishment, without necessarily a direct censorship, putting people in jail, but by crowding out any other kind of artistic endeavors or crowding out any other scientific research, which is precisely what government subsidies do.
And I would like to scratch a bit more on this on the specific way in which this process is established. And I think when she is trying to introduce this topic, she talks about the notion that these subsidies don't banish the truth from people speaking from it, but it banishes the truth from making it irrelevant for conversation. Could you explain a little bit more on why it becomes irrelevant? I think you've touched about that in the thing you said, but
Well, just look at right now what's going on. We have private corporations in this country who are all, not all, but a great many of them, the large corporations, are adopting the critical race theory and educating and training their employees along critical race theory lines. Where did this come from? This came from government encouragement of certain social science research done at universities. And those universities have crowded out in their own social science fields anything else other than intersectional kind of Marxism or their postmodernism. And that's it. And if you don't hew those intellectual lines, you just don't get the government research grants. You just don't get the financing, and you sure don't get the sanction. Because if you've got the National Institute of Humanities grant, you're the prestigious scientist. You're the guy with the highest credentials and the one who all the spotlight is going to be focused on. And in this way, it sort of creates an establishment, and it even affects the private sector. The private sector is now so afraid of social bans and cancel culture that they will toe the line, mostly out of fear, perhaps out of some sincerity. But what it does is it creates this establishment that no one dares question, and so it creates this stale gray conformity where all the commentators are saying in effect the same thing in an echo chamber.
I would like to revisit a bit more on the idea of um, Skinner, not only because she mentions Skinner, but also his ideas, to my understanding of psychology, are just banished away from today's studies of psychology. But I would like to push a bit more on the idea of if like if I were more like a devil's advocate, I would say, okay, the problem is that all the money is going to people who have been rewarded any kind of who are famous in their field. But why don't you put some money to the people who are promising or the people who are maybe good?
Oh, see, this is the very thing. Once government starts directing money, it's not going to direct money to the newcomers, the radical new ideas, the untested ones. They're untested. They haven't achieved prestige within their field. They haven't towed the party line, perhaps. And so it's the people, the outsiders, the people with truly new ideas, who are going to be disfavored in all of this necessarily, because they don't belong to the consensus. They will be the nuts on the outside, the fringes. But that's, of course, where all new ideas and real cultural dynamism comes from. The outsider, the guy swimming against the current. But of course, it's the current that's going to have the cultural current that's going to have all of the subsidies, precisely because it's the current. It's the currently prestigious thing. And so new ideas and young innovators are going to have a hell of a time, the hardest time breaking through. Because again, well, just as in economic regulations, just as economic regulations and subsidies crowd out new economic competitors and make it all the harder for new innovative startups and entrepreneurs. So in the realm of culture, the same thing. New ideas in art, new ideas in the humanities and philosophy have just a hell of a time, a harder time breaking through because the establishment has sort of created its consensus establishment. It's in so many different fields that you see this today. In one sense, it's gotten worse because government has taken control, even in my country, of education, research, art grants, scientific grants. If you're a scientist who doesn't believe in catastrophic man-made global warming, what are your odds of getting a research grant to do your study? Now, it may be that none of the predictive models so far have worked, or at least none of the standard ones using a greenhouse effect have predicted much effectively at all. That doesn't matter. Truth really won't matter so long as you're flowing in the cultural mainstream. And so any outsider ideas can't come through. Or take government science on nutrition. For years, government said we need more carbohydrates, more sugar in our diet. We now realize that it wasn't the fat and the butter that was giving people heart disease. It was the spikes, blood sugar spikes, who was causing inflammation of the arteries. So you can eat all the fat you want if you don't have any carbs in your diet. Not saying that one diet or the other is necessarily scientifically correct. It's just that when government promotes a certain view, for decades it becomes the orthodoxy, the consensus, and anyone trying to say something on the outside has an all the harder time penetrating with his truth. In art, my gosh, the if you take one of these urban art walks in America, it's all the same political hack 50-year-old hoary old themes that are being done in so-called cutting edge art, and it's just boring same old stuff from decades ago.
I While reading this, I also saw a parallel with the field I know about, economics, and I remember my classes of public finance, in which we dealt a lot about how to evaluate public projects, what they call um, a public investment. And for instance, they try to see, okay, we have the money to build a bridge. Should we build it? And they say, okay, we should build this bridge if the social cost, whatever that means, is greater than the social, it's less than the social benefit, whatever that means. But even if you granted that, there was never any discussion on what um, the alternatives were, which is like econ 101 concept of opportunity costs. Um, and even so, what I'm trying to say is that even if there was a value in that thing that came up, that bridge, for instance, how can you tell that that's valuable in the overall wider context?
You
And
cannot.
and in
You can.
ideas, I think it's worse, right?
Oh, all the worse. You simply cannot. Take B.F. Skinner. Behaviorism in its time was a fad. We could look at lab rats and conclude all that we need to do mostly about human psychology. We don't need to consider that human beings think or choose or anything like that. They're basically acting on conditioned reflexes like lab rats. Now, that idea, as you've pointed out, was Ayn Rand, before she wrote this article, did an article on B.F. Skinner in which she thoroughly attacked Beyond Freedom and Dignity as a pernicious idea. And she was a severe critic of B.F. Skinner. And she was a severe critic of behaviorists getting government grants for all of this research that, as you point out, turned out to be a bunch of a whole school of thought that has since been abandoned by serious psychologists. In fact, in the realm of psychology, Ayn Rand has kind of won the day. It's cognitive behavioral psychology since the 1970s, which has sort of taken over the realm, at least the realm of therapy. So Ayn Rand won the day, in effect, on that argument. But what I find really interesting is here in this article, she's sort of pointing out that the conservative, who's attacking B.F. Skinner for getting the subsidies is just as wrong as the liberal magazine that was saying, no, 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 we've got to give the subsidies to everybody who's worthy. Both sides, in effect, though, accept the premise of government subsidies. They just don't like the government subsidies going, the conservatives just don't like this government subsidies going to fund anti-American ideas. He doesn't question the premise of whether the government should be subsidizing ideas at all. And so, in a sense, Ayn Rand is taking the side of the Skinner against the anti-Skinner critic just as much as she's taking the side against Skinner. Both of them are wrong. Both of them are dead wrong. Ideas cannot be a matter of government subsidization. Otherwise, bad ideas will linger longer than they have to, like behaviorism, and good ideas won't get the proper play that they deserve until they somehow endure and break through that establishment.
Taking a small deviation, do you happen to know why, despite all these subsidies and all this massive push to subsidize Skinner's ideas, his intellectual legacy just went away?
Well, I think poor Skinner was up against the facts of reality. I think that his approach was simply unfruitful in human psychology, or even higher mammal psychology, frankly. He just cannot cope with the actual complexities of human psychology. And it was the humanist cognitive side of things, the Carl Rogers and the Abraham Maslow's, Magda Arnold's, Nathaniel Branden's, who in effect took over the field by the 1980s simply because their approach to therapy was far more effective and and seemed to take into account far more of the reality of human psychology. We think we're creatures of habit. And when you get those ideas in, you've got cognitive behavioral psychology. You have to take into account the actual complexities of the creative human mind that we think might be relevant to psychology. But what's funny is that Science magazine and Nature magazine, within the last 10 years, have done repeated stories on how scientific studies in the social sciences, psychology in particular, and the humanities cannot be reproduced. Published in peer-reviewed journals, academic journals. And no matter what scientific journal or academic journal or peer-reviewed journal that it appears in, most of these so-called scientific studies about psychology, social science, human behavior, you name it, are simply not reproducible. It's not even science the government is mostly funding.
Or well, maybe they went also to economics, right, with the behavioral economics idea.
The funny thing is that in economics, while it isn't even a predictive science at this point, it at least has some reproducible results. Nearly every single one of the social sciences and humanities, when you look at the recent studies, so-called scientific studies, just a huge percentage of them are just nonsense. The data that they claim to have found from the study simply cannot be reproduced in other studies that are even trying to get at it. Just a bunch of BS, really. The famous Stanford study where they show that a large percentage of people are just sadistic, when they give the electric shocks to people. Well, they tried to reproduce that very study again and again and again, and it turns out that study was just fraught with errors, cannot be reproduced, and yet for decades it was cited as basic science in the field of psychology and human behavior. Government science is notoriously inaccurate and notoriously creates an establishment that you sort of have to break through. Now, the truth can break through. Behaviorism crumbled.
That's interesting. I didn't know that experiment didn't end up being replicable.
Oh, indeed. They found that it was fraudulent, and they actually did research on the research itself and the way they prepared the subjects. The study was not scientifically conducted, as it turns out.
I didn't know that. So I wanted to move a bit more towards the consequences of this establishment. And first thing that popped into my mind was something that I just watched in this new Netflix documentary of the tyrants. And basically, one of the things that they mention is that someone convinced a scientist convinced Stalin, well, scientist convinced Stalin that seeds also
Lysenko.
were also subject to the process of dialectic materialism. So if you put seeds on winter, like in really cold places, then they would be like used to the winter and cold places and everything, and then you would have plentiful uh, abundance of food in winter and whatever. And obviously it was massive starvation. Do you think that this is related to the consequences of that
Well,
establishment?
I think the Soviet Union, and certainly the Soviet Union under Stalin, was an old fashioned, hardcore, send you to Siberia kind of censorship. Ayn Rand is talking specifically about Western cultures that don't have, a direct or a powerful censorship in which the stale conformity exists anyway. The case you're pointing out is a notorious example of government science and the evils of having a real censorship. Um, uh, there was a brilliant scientist who was creating a seed library, maybe the greatest seed library. He'd visited the United States around World War I, collected all of these different domesticated seeds for crops. That inspired him to go all the way around the world and to try and find every kind of domesticated crop seed he could find in the most remote locations of the world. He was like an Indiana Jones hero. And he creates in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, this seed library, maybe the best seed library in the world. Now, his enemy was a friend of Stalin, a guy named Lysenko. He was not a scientist. He was a Marxist and a trained Marxist. And he believed, that, Marxism at the time was thought to be more consistent with not Darwinian evolution, but Lamarckian evolution. And if you know the difference, exposing those seeds will make a difference to the seed's outcome, not their genetics or genetic change. Well, we know better now. But in those days, certainly back in the 30s and 40s, it was thought by the Soviet Union, and that was their official line, that something more Lamarckian in evolution must be true. And therefore, everything that this other scientist is doing is wrong and needs to be suppressed. He had the wrong friends. He was asking people from foreign countries, so he was suspicious anyway. So this guy Lysenko beat out the real scientist. The real scientist was given one of these ridiculous show trials. Was his death sentence was commuted to 20 years. He was never heard from again. The real scientist and hero in the Soviet Union there. And this Lysenko guy, of course, became the cherished friend of Stalin, became this cherished hero who, of course, helped cause even more starvation because of his ridiculously anti-scientific ideas. But of course, when it's at the point of a gun, truth doesn't matter, does it? Ideology, the ideology of Marxism, will trump. And if your science doesn't seem to be consistent with the ideological line of Marxism, then they will suppress it and, if necessary, kill you or imprison you if you don't toe that line. That's a great example of that. But that's a direct example of direct send you to Siberia kind of censorship, right?
Yes, I was seeing it more on the side of the established, like the friend of Stalin, more than the poor guy who got sent to Siberia. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, but that is a classic example of government research, government science, government subsidizing ideas. Once the government, public education must necessarily do this. You can't teach math. You can't teach science. You certainly can't teach history. You certainly can't teach literature. In my country, classic books that oppose racism, like To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee or Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, two of our greatest novelists in this country. Many school districts have banned those anti-racist classic books because what? They don't toe the current party line, and so but the point is, wait, anytime you educate children, you're going to have to make value judgments. You're going to have to make philosophical assessments. Is is Huckleberry Finn by Twain worth teaching? Or is it teaching kids bad ideas? And so education as such has to make those kind of value judgments. Even government primary education is forcing a certain establishment down people's throats, whether it's a modest, moderate, pro-national patriotism party line that the kids all come and say, yes, we love our country, or our state religion, Christianity or Islam, or is it even more specific and leftist, teaching them critical race theory or postmodernism or Marxism? But something's got to be taught kids. Are we going to teach them reading and writing? Or are we going to teach them critical race theory? When we teach them reading and writing, are we going to allow them to read Mark Twain? Or are we going to make them read some critical race theory nut jobs book? When the government enters the realm of education as such, whether as educators or merely as subsidizers of research and education, they are necessarily creating a cultural and intellectual establishment that forces out other ideas and makes it all the harder for the truly new innovators, the truly new ideas to break through.
I was hoping to move the discussion towards how is exactly the way that this orthodoxy is established, but I think you've touched about that several times. I don't know if you want to, if there's something that you would like to add, or maybe I was also hoping to talk about this idea of she quotes something like the king used to be sometimes a bit bounded by some sense of justice, but the friends of the king, they used to be like the worst of the worst. Could you talk also about that?
Well, yeah, it's a classic phenomenon in the history of monarchy, isn't it? The king loves to be popular. The king loves to go on the parade and get cheered. The king loves to be secure in his position and not think that there's going to be a peasant revolt someplace in the country because of his tax policies or something. But there are the bootlickers, there are the courtiers. They are the ones who are striving for favor with the king. And the king can't give his favor to everybody, can he? Some people are going to get favored over others. And of course, very frequently, what they're trying to do is appease the monarch rather than the people. And so it's easy for the monarch himself, as well as the people, to turn around and hate these privileged power abusers. Some chief minister of some king who wants to be seen as popular can blame the chief minister, and the entire public can blame the chief minister, and there's some truth to it, because the chief minister has generally gotten fat and wealthy through the political favors, the power that the prestige and power that he's gotten by having his position. Just to be the bootlicker that gets that position suggests that kind of the worst sort of second-handers are going to get the job in the first place. But once they get that job, they now have a privileged position as friend of the king. Everyone's afraid of them as friend of the king. If you're the friend of the king, in a sense, you don't even have the constraints of the king's desire for popularity. All you need is the king's protection, and everybody has to fear you. And that is a story that played out again and again and again. Like I say, your more clever monarchs would, if the policy became unpopular, even if he'd been behind it, blame the chief minister. Ooh, that bad guy. It wasn't me. But of course, that was the guy that everybody feared, because he was the guy who sent the troops around to enforce the tax, or sent the troops along to collect the soldiers for the war. No, that was a classic phenomenon of the second-hander, lick-spittle toadies that surrounded kings, people of the absolute worst character, who had privileged power and position, and who very frequently abused it because they didn't even have the constraints of the king to want to be popular.
Yes. Do you have any particular example of that? Because I have one, but it's modern.
There are so
Or
many. There are so many. How many kings in the history of Europe blamed, how many Louis the 13th blamed Richelieu's? How many Louis the 14th blamed Mazarins? How many
okay,
Henry the 8th
yes,
blamed
Henry
Cromwell?
VIII.
I mean, over and over and over. I've heard this. This is a broken record in European history.
The one that I was thinking about is in Mexico. There's some. We have even a name for them, like the juniors, because they're usually the sons of the people in power, and you know what they do, and their motto is, you know who my dad is, because
That's
they
it.
always say that.
That's it. That's it. That's so frequent. Yes, I don't. It is not a racial thing. I don't want anyone to say this, but very frequently in my travels in Latin America, when you meet elites, that's what they'll say. You know who my dad is in the government, as if that should be relevant to how I treat you or our discussion or our opinions. Yeah, that's an
um
establishment for sure. Almost an aristocratic establishment.
yes. um and let us move to something a bit more positive, and well, not the most positive thing of all, but um she talks about how for the honest man this is going to be a very steep ladder to climb upon, but that there is also another kind of people who will be able to climb that ladder, and she calls that the pyramid of endurance. Could you talk a bit more about that, um, and how does it help to the people who won't be able to climb the ladder?
No. Well, I'll go back to the first example that I used, film. Imagine being a young screenwriter. Your ambition is to be a young screenwriter and write movies in Hollywood. And you've got interesting ideas and interesting plots, and you think that people are going to enjoy your stories. And it's you're not breaking through. You can't break through. They're not interested in your stories. You're not following the PC line. You're not doing a reboot of something that was successful before. You're not using formula ABC versus XYZ. You're doing something creative and new. Well, it takes a certain amount of emotional endurance to take no after no after no, to like Howard Rourke in The Fountainhead had to endure no after no after no before he found the few people who could really see him, give him his first chances, give him the opportunity, and slowly start that reputation building. And he wasn't even working in a field of architecture that was subsidized by government. It's hard enough given the inertia of established culture and the status quo in a culture. That's hard enough. To do it with the additional uh, burden of having to get through a government created party line or consensus is all the harder. So the it takes a person of extreme mental independence, extreme confidence and self-esteem, and extreme endurance to make through the sort of mountain climbing quest that such an establishment creates. You have to penetrate, barrier after barrier after unnecessary barrier, making it 10 times harder than it already is for the true innovator, the true outsider, to get a hearing if he's got a value to offer people. So yeah, so there's this sort of pyramid, upside down, sort of perverse thing where most of the people who are achieving things are just the mediocrities, and as you go down at the very tip, you have of that pyramid of endurance, the only creative stuff that gets through, the only really interesting stuff that gets through, is a very small trickle of a minority, precisely because they had the psychological endurance to take it for 50 years before they could even get one little hearing. I've known people like that. I've known artists like that. I've known writers like that. Man, have I known people like that. I've known of course, objectivist intellectuals have a hell of a time. We have tenured professors, several numerous, world class tenured academics. But for them to have broken through the way they did was nothing short of the highest kind of heroism of endurance, not just independence of mind.
and and there's also the issue of the good average man, like I forgot the name in the Fountainhead, the mason.
Michael,
um
the construction worker friend.
yes, Mike, sorry. um but
What a
and even
wonderful relationship that is between Rourke and
yes,
Mike, isn't it?
and
Mike
even
loved humanity. She did, just as such.
and she talks that they're like the real true victims of this kind of policy. Um, but and she talks about this idea of people thinking about when they are pressed upon an issue like this, when there's this establishment, they are going to have fear of getting some enemies, and also they are going to be a bit skeptical of their. She
Afraid
she
of stepping
says
on toes.
something.
Who am I going to piss off? Do I really want to irritate this person? That person may have friends. That person may be the source of my subsidy. Who am I going to irritate? Don't rock the boat. Let's make the fewest waves possible. And so she talks about the editors of intellectual magazines. If you ever have the misfortune of discussing something with the editor of an intellectual magazine, in my experience, they are just as she explains. Let's not irritate. Let's try and, find the balance here, the middle of the road. Let's not make enemies. Let's not irritate anyone. And you're not going to get a very interesting or exciting product if your intellectual magazines, if your magazines of ideas and debate and discussion are worried in that fashion. And believe me, Slate, the New Republic, the New Statesman, all of these intellectual publications are towing a party line that cannot be varied from. If you're a liberal thinker out there, a leftist thinker in America, you have to be careful what you say, or they will cancel you for something that's just slightly outside of the party line.
Sorry, James. I think I'm having problems with my internet in case that something happens.
I haven't noticed it at all.
Okay. There's also the. I also want to become a devil's advocate again, and say, okay, I understand your issue against this establishing of an establishment, but at the same time, if we leave these things free, like no subsidies to cinema or any other sense of intellectual or cultural endeavors, then the rich are going to take over. Then they are going to direct both scientific and intellectual pursuits according to their agenda.
It's so
What would you
funny.
say?
It's so funny because on the one hand, they'll say, well, wait a minute, in a free market, Elvis Presley earns more money than Albert Einstein. And on the other hand, they'll say that only the rich will control things. No, not true. No, some of the richest people in the private economy are the ones who have the biggest vested interest in producing new science. And you look at the world, for example, today. I'm not saying the American pharmaceutical industry is a perfectly free market. It is not. It has to appease the Food and Drug Administration, and they're talking about failure of government science, regulations that required drugs to be both safe and effective before they could be marketed in the United States, prevented blood pressure medicines like beta blockers, even though they had been proven safe, from being given to severe heart patients. Hundreds of thousands of people died waiting for the government to approve a drug that had been determined to be safe and that was saving lives in Europe for years. Beta blockers. Well, so pharmaceutical industry is not a free market in this country. It has heavy regulations to deal with too. But even so, in the semi sort of free market that is the United States, what is it? 80% of all the new medicines come from the United States. One country produces nearly all of the new medical techniques and medicines in the world? No. When the government gets out, science actually does better. When the government wasn't involved in science, because let's face it, in medieval times, you either had a patron, a lord, or you didn't do your work. The new establishment is almost creating a medieval environment in which you need the patronage of government rather than some wealthy lord or something to be your artistic patron. The free market is the answer, obviously, to real artistic and real scientific innovation. It is no accident that the 1800s, the 19th century, and the early 20th century were the most vibrant time when it came to technological innovation and artistic innovation. That was the period of the great romantics. That was the period in which the light bulb recorded sound, the perfection of photography, the development of the automobile, the invention of the airplane, all the telephone, all of that came into being without government subsidies. No, if you were a friend of progress, science, artistic innovation, you'd be opposed to government subsidies just as you'd be opposed to the bootlicking patronage of some medieval lord that the artists 600 years ago needed to do.
Can I push a bit more on that? Um, and again, as a devil's advocate, what if I say, okay, I understand that the link between the giving people's freedom to direct investment in intellectual pursuits, but at the same time, I think that scientists should have any kind of intellectual liberty that they don't have. For instance, if I want to study the um, left wing of a little fly that nobody knows, and that's the purpose of my life. And since I'm a biologist, I won't get hired because of that, and then I will have to become a veterinarian because of this capitalist world that we
Oh,
live in.
well, look, if your design, look, we have all these things are kind of trade-offs. If the joy of studying something that has no immediate practical economic effect that you could know is so great to you that you just want to know the answer to that question motivates you, then money isn't your motivation. If you, to the extent that it might affect other people's lives, then yeah, there's going to be an economic support system out there, a private economic support system out there that's going to fund your research because it might make a difference to ordinary people's lives and someone might make $1 million from such an innovation. But let's say it's just pure research, pure scientific research, studying some obscure thing, like you're saying, that doesn't have any immediate economic consequences. I could easily see myself because I've sort of did that. I had in my own biography, I had a sort of mixed practical job as a lawyer, but then I was doing this research for the last 35 years, historical research that I knew wasn't going to make me any real money, that I knew wasn't the way to become a millionaire, but it was a question, a scientific question that just fascinated me. I found time to do that. It was the thing I wanted to do. I devoted a great deal of energy to it. I was free to do it. No one stopped me. And in this field, there certainly is an intellectual establishment, but I have free speech, and I could publish my work. I could send it out to different scholars, get their criticism and comments on it. I was still free to make this discovery. And if there's no immediate consequences to this discovery, I don't deserve $1 million. I deserve the satisfaction that I got from finding the answer to the question and sharing it with others. I'm not stopped. Only force can stop people from discovering ideas. And if government research is going to things like, that don't have any immediate obvious economic impact on people, then let me suggest it's a giant waste of money anyway.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm curious about how you see the environment of religious studies, historical religious studies in your field. Do you think it's an establishment, or do you think it's way much vibrant and um,
Well, it was an establishment, a horrible establishment that was enforced by real censorship. You only have to go back 300 or 400 years, and people were being tortured and burned alive for stepping just a little. There were Christians stepping outside of the Orthodox Christian line of their country, and they would get tortured and burned for slightly different viewpoints, just like books would get burned if they said something even slightly different. Uh, Isaac Newton, for example, had he was a Christian, but he had unconventional Christian ideas, and he could not make them public. His successor at Cambridge as the Lucasian professor of mathematics was fired from Cambridge University because his religious views, he was the standard translator of Josephus, his religious views were so outside. They weren't the Anglican views, and you had to be an Anglican to teach at Cambridge in the 1700s because it was a religious institution, in effect. So he lost his job, And he was just a variant kind of Christian. So in the past 300 years, things have gotten a lot better than that. And once more, it was the 19th century, the 1800s, that saw the great scientific burst of activity here. For the first time, scientific textual analysis was applied to the documents of the New Testament. For the first time, scientific historical methods were being applied to the history of Christianity. And critical biblical scholarship was born in the 19th century, the great age of capitalism. That's where the innovation all came from. Since then, what's really interesting is that since then, there were some problems that developed, and of course, it ran up against the Orthodox Christians. So you got Christian apologists who didn't like it altogether. But there is a world of critical scholarship in the academic world, but it sort of has its own establishment because it too is afraid of both irritating to some extent the apologists, but also towing their own academic government subsidized line, just like every other field of academia. So in the 20th century, in my view, in the 20th century, creativity went downhill, even in the area of biblical criticism, because an increasing government created and subsidized academic establishment was being created. Today, there really is such an establishment that's really hard to break through for anyone with truly innovative ideas. Which I think is where it's all at, and it's ready for a revolution. So it makes it all the harder for me to get through because there is this sort of encouraged establishment, as Ayn Rand calls it, that is dominating this field as in most other fields of the humanities.
Thank you. I have two more questions to go. And the next one is about something that she talks very quickly, and it's about the idea that there have always been cliques on arts, but she says that these have made able for artists, challenging artists, to come up. Could you do you know what she means by that? Could you describe this?
We all know that there are movements and groups and even social cliques within ideological and cultural movements, right? One could look at big movements, even say French Impressionist art, right? And say that was a sort of a movement by itself. But how did that clique get developed? That clique got developed because it was critical of the academic painters of the time who were doing this hyper-realistic stuff. They didn't think it was impressionistic and emotional enough. So I'm not a Hegelian. I don't think that a thesis leads to its antithesis. But at least when people are free, at least when there's no government censorship and no government encouragement and subsidies, then there's this communication. There's this bouncing off of each other. I'm going to react to you. I'm going to do something different. No, I don't like that part. I'm going to go over here and then maybe start my own movement or my own clique if others agree with me or not. But at least I have a chance to step outside, do something different, and react. As, say, happens, people are social, and they will gravitate into schools and movements and cliques. But in a free market, they're reacting to each other in a free way. And individuals, who are the only real source of innovation, can do their own thing and start a new movement.
Thank you. And the last question has to do with something that she mentions just at the beginning, and she doesn't talk a lot about that, partially because she talks more in other essays, and that it's the idea that the mixed economy is unstable, and even if there is an intervention in some area, it will expand to other areas that weren't meant to be. Could you talk about that instability, and then maybe put it on a positive level, that maybe that instability could also lead to freedom as well?
Yeah, the second part may be the harder part for me to answer, but just look at the history of government subsidies in my country. Once upon a time in the United States, the federal government subsidized no science, no education, and practically no art except the statue on the top of the Capitol building, right? Just a few public instances of art. So when government was in effect out of the entire area of culture, America had an extremely vibrant culture, extremely vibrant in the areas of science, technology, artistic innovation. The music, the movies, think of the vibrance of American culture in the early 20th century, creating a whole new art form, motion pictures, jazz music, popular music with all its different recording forms spreading across the world. America was technologically and culturally innovative and dynamic. Well, the government started what we need to do is we need to research. Well, obviously we need military research, and that's going to lead. Well, we also need medical research, and and certain kinds of scientific research might be helpful too. And gosh, a trip to the moon might be really good because we don't let the Soviets beat us to the moon. As glorious and wonderful as was the Americans getting to the moon, it's still a government project. Government directed project, and government more and more and more crowding out in the world of science. Well, if we could subsidize science, why not the arts? And if we could subsidize the arts, then why not the humanities? And now suddenly it's not just the hard sciences like medicine or space exploration that are getting the subsidies. It's now artists. It's now teachers of the humanities and the social sciences, sociology professors and history teachers are getting subsidies. And now an establishment in those areas is being created. And now the struggle in my country is really over that. Who controls that establishment? Is it, for example, the postmodernists and the Marxists and the intersectionalists and the critical race theory? Because they're trying to create an educational establishment, clearly, of their own through government schools and government subsidies of their projects? Or will it be the right wing's notion of an establishment, a more religion-friendly, patriotic version of civics and history? Both, of course, are wanting the government to subsidize and educate the young on their view of values. Both are wrong. Government's got to get out of the education and research business altogether, or we risk innovation and rational thought, the operation of rational thought itself. We risk returning to the stale conformity of the Dark Ages if we allow such an establishment to keep moving in that direction. Pretty soon it will be a real censorship at the point of a gun. Why not? As Mises said, isn't it what we put into our mind at least as important as what we put into our body? If the government can regulate the taking of drugs, why, what is a safe drug and not a safe drug to put into our bodies? Why can't they regulate the books we read and the movies we watch?
Here in Britain, they are putting something like they call it like a free speech czar in the universities.
A free speech czar. Talk about an oxymoron. A czar, one of the most absolutistic kind of monarchs in European history, a czar, a totalistic czar, over free speech. Now, we're going to force you all to be free, but we're not going to allow Holocaust deniers, as evil as Holocaust deniers are. Holocaust deniers, where have they lost their John Stuart Mill? False ideas need to be given as wide a hearing as possible if you want truth to win. Free speech is the cleansing of false ideas by giving false ideas a full hearing. And of course, that is exactly the opposite of what's going on when you have laws against hate speech. You can't say anything that would offend a Muslim, et cetera, et cetera.
But this trend can be reversed, right? What is the recipe?
I did say that would be the harder part of the question to answer. No, it is true that so long as we don't have an overt censorship, and we're getting dangerously close in my mind, and closer and closer, let's put it that way. I don't regard Facebook, putting things down or putting warnings up as a real censorship. I mean a real censorship. So long as we're short of a real censorship, a better set of ideas can break through and can make a difference. I guess my only real examples, though, that I have are objectivism or neo-Aristotelianism or the bootleg romanticism in some art that is peeking through now. And at least that's possible. And it really, people do have free will. And we do in the West have enough freedom to read and embrace those ideas. Even if, we were sent to public schools and sent to universities with all these subsidized establishment ideas, we still can go out and read books like Ayn Rand's or something, or read my book on Christianity or something, and get different ideas from outside the establishment. And those can conceivably take hold. One example that I gave earlier was the takeover of cognitive psychology. Even with behaviorism getting all those government subsidies, behaviorism was not able to win the day in the field of psychological theory, was it? It was the cognitive behavioralists, the people more like Ayn Rand, that did win the day. There's an example of truth winning out. But the sad thing is now those people are getting the government subsidies and are creating an establishment so that if anyone wants to criticize some of those ideas, they're having a harder and harder time. So it makes it harder. It creates a pyramid of endurance, as we say. But for those who have the endurance, those heroes might yet lead us out. And that's the most optimistic I'm afraid I can be.
Thank you. We have last minute super chats. The first one is from Robert, who says, "Your tax dollars at work against you," and then money backs. And then Jeff, there is no comment from that, but thank you. And the other one is from Phil, and his question is, "Aren't the real antagonists of individualism and rationality current day politicians of both left and right as establishment of cronism?"
Well, yeah, they are real enemies, both the left and the right. And this whole cronyism, mixed economy thing is exactly what's wrong. And, the Department of Education, a federal Department of Education, was founded in 1979 under the Carter administration in this country. America was number one in educational standards in the 1970s. In the last 40 years, the United States has fallen to 26th in math and science and basic literacy. So during the course of most of my lifetime, for over the last 40 years, since the government has created a Department of Education, educational standards have gone down straight into the toilet. So, yeah, the more government there is in this, the more government subsidies there is in this, and both left and right. Notice the right hasn't done anything to even end the little public television subsidy. This teeny little subsidy the public television could get along without. And of course, public television is nothing but left-wing propaganda. No, yeah, both sides have conceded this point. They just want their ideas to get the favors and the subsidies. Yeah, they're the enemies. But the real enemy, of course, are the philosophers who make this possible, who give them the cover, the justification, create the moral high ground over which the politicians fight. So yeah, politicians of both sides are villains in this, but the real villains behind it all are intellectual leaders. And I put that in air quotes, are intellectual leaders, are philosophers.
Thank you, James. Is there any concluding remarks that you would like to make?
It is another example. This is an amazing. I say this maybe every time we do an Ayn Rand essay. Ayn Rand's prescience, her ability to see the future, astonishes me. We're looking at a 50-year-old essay that really nails what's going on today so brilliantly. Even more, it characterizes our period even more than it does her period. Those Ayn Rand X-ray vision glasses could see the evils of the New Left and environmentalism, tribalism, and here, the subsidized creation of an intellectual establishment, even in free countries. Boy, did she nail that.
I agree completely. Well, thank you very much for this amazing talk, James. It's been really great as always. For the people in the audience, if you appreciate this kind of talk as well, please feel free to become a member. Membership starts on £10 a month. If you're in the US, the pound is down, so you can profit from that.
Hey, better deal today.
Better deal today. And please join us next Wednesday as always.
Thank you. Your questions are outstanding as always, Alejandro. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.